When I saw my husband's car parked in the driveway hours before it was supposed to return, my heart skipped a beat, not from joy, but from a sudden, paralyzing dread. I stood at the kitchen window, my hand still clutching the damp dish towel, staring as his silhouette moved inside the car. He didn't get out immediately, he just sat there, the faint outline of his hands gripping the steering wheel, as if gathering himself. I knew that look, even from a distance. Something was wrong. Something had shifted. My breath caught when he finally opened the door, the creak of metal sounding like the opening line of a confession I wasn't ready to hear. I thought of the messages. The ones I should have deleted. The ones that weren't supposed to exist at all. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out the ordinary hum of the refrigerator. He reached for his bag, but his movements were slower than usual, deliberate. He glanced up toward the kitchen window, and our eyes met for a split second that felt like a chasm. I pressed the towel harder into my palm, as if its texture could anchor me in this reality. He walked to the trunk, lifted it open, and I wondered absurdly, desperately, if he might have seen something. If someone had told him. If the fragile shell of my carefully maintained life was already cracking in his hands. The air between us felt charged, as though the house itself held its breath, waiting. And then it struck me, like a cold wave, he didn't even know yet. Not really. But he would. He would soon. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that unraveled the quiet threads of my life and left me standing here, trembling, about to tell you how everything truly began. Before I take you through the story I've hidden for so long, tell me, have you ever carried a secret so heavy, you felt it might split you open at any moment? The house has felt emptier lately, as though it's been hollowed out by routine. Each day folds into the next, gray and indistinguishable, like pages from an unremarkable book. My husband leaves early, returns late, and when he is here, the television or the news on his phone absorb what little presence he offers. Our son is grown now, half living out of the house, his shoes only occasionally by the door, his laughter a rare visitor. I had grown accustomed to the quiet hum of solitude, but not to the ache it left in its wake. I wasn't expecting anyone that evening. The day had been long but uneventful. I'd wandered the aisles of the supermarket, selecting vegetables I wasn't sure I'd cook, washed dishes that no one had used but me. It was already dark when I heard the knock on the door. Not the hesitant tap of a stranger, but a firm, familiar rhythm. I dried my hands on the dish towel and opened it to find my son's friend standing there, his posture uneven, one hand clutching his shoulder. He looked younger somehow in that moment, despite being a man in every way, grown, independent, but with that hint of vulnerability that caught me off guard. He explained, almost apologetically, that he'd hurt himself at training. Something about an awkward fall. My son had insisted he stop by, said he could rest here, that we had space. I hesitated for a heartbeat too long, feeling the weight of the quiet house pressing in behind me, then stepped aside. Of course, I said, my voice softer than I expected. Come in. He followed me into the kitchen, his bag slung over one good shoulder. I noticed how careful he was, how his eyes flickered around the room as though gauging where he fit in this space. I fetched ice for his shoulder, trying to ignore the awareness creeping in, awareness of how different it felt, having someone else here, someone who wasn't my husband or my son. The air felt subtly altered, like the faint shift of wind before a storm. My husband called later, his voice crackling through the speakerphone. Another delay, he said, his words brisk, detached. I'll be back in 2 days, maybe 3. I nodded even though he couldn't see me, murmured something reassuring. When I hung up, I stared at the blank screen for a moment too long, listening to the silence fill the space he'd left in the conversation. We ate a light dinner, just soup and bread. My son had gone out to meet friends, promising to return late. That left the two of us, seated across from one another at the kitchen table. He thanked me more than once, as if gratitude could make up for the intrusion, but I told him it was nothing. And it wasn't. Not yet. Later, after he'd showered and changed into a loose t-shirt, he appeared in the living room, tentative but polite. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, standing awkwardly with his hand still touching his shoulder. The bruise was spreading, faint but noticeable. I told him the guest room was ready, that he should get some rest. When I finally sat down on the couch, the house felt different, like its walls were holding something they hadn't before. I listened to the faint creak of floorboards above, the running water of the bathroom, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, the thrum of awareness. I tried to dismiss it, to file it under the category of motherly concern or simple human kindness, but it lingered like the echo of a whisper in a quiet room. By the time I climbed into bed, the house had gone still. But it was a different kind of stillness, the kind that hums, almost imperceptibly, as if something unspoken has been set in motion. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, aware of his presence down the hall. Not thinking of anything in particular, and yet thinking of everything all at once. The morning began with a faint ache in my chest, the kind that has nothing to do with illness but everything to do with unease. I woke earlier than usual, the room still dim, the curtains drawn against a muted dawn. The silence of the house was familiar, yet I felt a new tension in it, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I moved through the routine almost automatically, making tea, setting bread on the counter, all the while aware of his presence down the hall. It wasn't the same awareness as when my son was a teenager and brought friends over, it wasn't the watchful, parental kind. It was quieter, sharper, and far more unsettling. I heard him stir before I saw him. Floorboards creaked above, water ran faintly through the pipes, and then there was the soft thump of footsteps coming toward the kitchen. When he appeared in the doorway, hair slightly mussed, wearing the same t-shirt from last night, I realized I'd been holding my breath. He greeted me with a half-smile, the kind that doesn't demand a return but somehow asks for one anyway. I returned it, too quickly, and turned back to the kettle, hoping the motion would disguise the heat creeping into my face. He mentioned his shoulder was still sore, almost in passing, as though he didn't want to burden me. But I caught the small wince when he shifted his arm, the way he rotated it as if testing the limits of pain. I asked if it hurt much, and he shrugged in that understated way younger men sometimes do, masking discomfort behind a thin sheet of stoicism. I told him I might have something that could help, that I used to keep massage oil for my own aches when my neck would stiffen from too much time at the desk. It was meant to sound casual, almost clinical, as though I were offering nothing more than an ice pack. I found the small bottle at the back of a bathroom shelf, dusty from disuse. The label had peeled in places, and as I held it, I wondered absently when the last time was that I'd used it. Not for him, not for my husband even, but for myself, to ease the knots in my back or the tension in my temples. It struck me how long it had been since I'd done something that felt remotely like care, for anyone, in that simple, tactile way. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I returned, one hand absently rubbing his shoulder. There was nothing suggestive about the scene, he looked almost sheepish, like someone caught between needing help and being embarrassed to ask for it. I told him to sit straighter, that I could try to loosen the stiffness, and he nodded once, his trust unspoken but heavy. The first touch was entirely innocent. My fingers pressed lightly against the curve of his shoulder, finding the tense spot he'd mentioned. He flinched, not from discomfort, but from the surprise of contact, and I felt my own breath hitch. The warmth of his skin beneath my hands was startling, almost jarring, as though I'd forgotten that other people carried heat like this. I moved my hands carefully, kneading gently where the muscle tightened under the surface. He was quiet, his head slightly bowed, as if he didn't want to intrude on my focus. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the walls closer, the clock louder. I told myself this was just care, that my hands were doing what anyone's would have done in the same position. But then there was a pause, a heartbeat too long between one motion and the next, and something shifted in the air. His eyes lifted, meeting mine, not intentionally, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet inevitability. The look wasn't intense, but it was steady, and in it there was no misunderstanding. We both felt the moment tilt. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. My hands stayed where they were, resting lightly against his shoulder, and I couldn't bring myself to break the silence. It might have lasted a second, it might have lasted a lifetime. But it ended the way things like this always do, with a choice neither of us quite remembered making. We leaned closer, and then we stopped leaning because there was nothing left to close. We kissed. The simplicity of it, the abruptness, startled me. There was no build-up, no graceful arc, just the undeniable fact of it. And then it was over. My hands fell to my lap, and I stepped back so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. Neither of us spoke. He looked down, not ashamed, not proud, simply uncertain. I turned away, pretending to fuss with the bottle on the counter, anything to give my hands a task. The kitchen clock ticked louder, every second cutting through the heavy quiet. I muttered something about the oil being old, about needing to check if it had expired, as though that mattered. My voice sounded foreign in my own ears, thinner, almost brittle. He nodded once, not looking at me, and stood, mumbling thanks for the massage, for the tea, for things he didn't need to thank me for. The moment folded back into the morning, but the air never cleared. I carried the taste of that instant with me as I moved through the rest of the day, through the dishes, the calls, the meaningless errands. It was like a note of music left hanging in the room after the instrument has stopped playing. By afternoon, the house felt different again. Not louder or busier, just altered in that way you can't explain to anyone else. I tried to write it off as an accident, a lapse, something that would dissolve like steam from the kettle. But it didn't. It clung to me, quiet and insistent, the way certain truths do, long after you've tried to bury them. That night was different. I knew it even before I turned off the lights. It wasn't just the heaviness of the day or the fatigue that comes from too much thinking, it was the weight of what had happened in the kitchen that morning, the way it clung to me like humidity, seeping into every movement. When I climbed into bed, I lay flat on my back, staring at the faint shadows on the ceiling, my mind replaying those seconds again and again. The simplicity of it, that brief kiss, was what made it so impossible to dismiss. It hadn't been the result of too much wine or some dramatic emotional scene, it had been quiet, almost accidental, and that quiet made it louder in my mind. The house felt more alive than usual. I could hear the pipes shift when someone turned on the tap, the creak of the hallway floor when he moved around in the guest room. Normally, those noises meant nothing, background sounds in a living space, but now they meant him. Each one reminded me that he was there, a few walls away, probably lying awake just as I was, wondering what to do with the memory of this morning. At one point, close to midnight, I heard the faint scrape of the kitchen chair. A door opened softly. Footsteps. I didn't get up, but my breath caught. Was he getting water? Could he be standing in the dim kitchen now, hand on the refrigerator handle, maybe looking toward the staircase, maybe thinking of me? I turned on my side, pulling the blanket higher, as though it could shield me from my own thoughts. When I finally fell asleep, it was restless, a shallow, half-waking state. I woke before the alarm, the sky barely gray, my body heavy with exhaustion but my mind painfully alert. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, elbows on my knees, staring at the floor. My husband's side of the bed was cold, as it always was when he traveled. It hit me then how easily the absence of one person creates space for something, or someone else. By the time I went downstairs, the kitchen felt different, like walking onto a stage after a performance you didn't mean to give. The mug I'd used yesterday was still in the sink, the bottle of massage oil sat tucked away but not hidden enough, a reminder of what had started this chain. I heard him before I saw him again, footsteps on the stairs, a pause, then the soft sound of him descending. He walked into the room wearing a clean shirt, hair damp from a shower, the faint scent of soap still clinging to him. He smiled, awkward but warm, as though nothing had changed, but there was hesitation in his eyes. Breakfast was quiet. We exchanged a few words, practical things about bread, about the coffee being strong, but the space between each sentence felt longer, heavier. The kiss sat between us like an object on the table, even though neither of us dared to name it. Mid-morning brought our son back through the door, breaking the strange bubble we'd been floating in. His energy filled the space immediately, laughter bouncing off walls that had been holding tension all night. For a moment, I thought I could breathe again. The presence of my son created a kind of safety net. It returned the house to something familiar, ordinary. But even that safety had edges. I caught myself stealing glances when I shouldn't have. I noticed him, my son's friend, watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. Our eyes met once, briefly, in the hallway, and the moment felt too long, too loaded. I turned away, pretending to fuss with a stack of towels, but my chest felt tight. Later, he left for a while, saying something about picking up coffee from the cafe nearby. It was the kind of simple errand that didn't mean anything, except it did. Because when I found the note he left on the kitchen counter, a quick "be back soon" scrawled in his handwriting, I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't what the words said, but the fact that they existed at all. It was such an innocent gesture, but there was something about it, about him thinking to write it, about me reading it, that lodged itself under my skin. When he returned, he placed the coffee cup in front of me with the same quiet gratitude as before. I thanked him, my fingers brushing his for the briefest second as I took it. That tiny contact burned hotter than it should have. The rest of the afternoon blurred, ordinary tasks colliding with the unordinary tension I couldn't escape. I chopped vegetables with more force than needed, folded laundry that didn't need folding, as if movement alone could quiet the thoughts crowding my head. But the memory of the kiss wouldn't dissolve. It hovered just behind my eyelids whenever I blinked. It wasn't about romance or even attraction in the way people usually mean it. It was about something deeper, something harder to name, the shock of being seen again, of being in someone's awareness in a way that wasn't routine or obligatory. By evening, I sat on the couch, exhausted from doing nothing that actually tired my body. The house hummed with the same quiet sounds, but none of them were innocent anymore. They were all charged. The creak of the guest room door, the thud of his shoes on the floor, even the sound of his voice thanking me for dinner. I told myself I should forget it, let it fade like a misplaced thought. But even as I repeated that, I knew it wouldn't. Some things don't fade just because you will them to. They stay, low and quiet, waiting for the next moment to surface again. The next day unfolded with the kind of forced normalcy that only deepened the tension running under the surface. The house buzzed with activity in small, uneven bursts. My son stayed longer that morning, filling the kitchen with chatter as he scrolled on his phone and told half-finished stories from the night before. I moved around them both, setting out plates, brewing tea, the rhythm of my movements a deliberate attempt to keep my mind anchored in routine. But even in those ordinary motions, I felt the undercurrent, his presence like a steady hum in the room. I caught glimpses of him across the table. He sat next to my son, his injured shoulder slightly stiff, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his glass. When he laughed at something my son said, it was a light, unforced laugh. I found myself watching too closely, and when his eyes flickered up, meeting mine for the briefest instant, I looked away too quickly. Later, my son left again, friends, errands, the casual excuses of youth. The house shifted as soon as the door closed, the space between walls suddenly wider, emptier, but also more charged. I stood by the window for a moment after he left, staring at the street as if waiting for something unnamed to arrive. He was in the living room when I turned back, seated with a mug in his hand. The television played softly in the background, some daytime program neither of us were truly watching. The room felt both familiar and unfamiliar at once. The silence wasn't awkward, it was expectant, stretched thin like a string about to snap. I decided to go out. The decision came quickly, as though movement might break the static around us. I said I needed to get groceries, that I was running low on vegetables, and he offered to come along. There was no reason to refuse. Saying no would have sounded strange, almost pointed. So I nodded, grabbed my keys, and we stepped out together. The drive was quiet in the way that wasn't really quiet. The hum of the engine, the soft clicking of the turn signal, the occasional comment about the weather or the road, they filled the air, but underneath was the same unspoken thing neither of us dared name. At one point, as we drove through a stretch of tree-lined street, he adjusted the seatbelt with his good arm, wincing slightly as his shoulder tugged. I reached over instinctively, meaning only to help, but the brush of my fingers against his arm sent a jolt through me I hadn't expected. It was such a small thing, a fraction of a second, but it landed in my chest and stayed there. We stopped at the market, the mundane tasks oddly magnified. I chose tomatoes, he carried a bag of bread in his uninjured arm, and the entire scene might have looked ordinary to anyone passing by. But to me, every small gesture felt sharpened, the way he held open the door, the way our hands nearly touched when we both reached for a basket. Back in the car, the silence thickened again. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, it was worse. It was the kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. I focused on the road, the streetlights sliding past, pretending to study the list of things we'd bought even though I already knew it by heart. When we returned home, my son wasn't back yet. The house greeted us with the same stillness it had the night before, but now it felt heavier, more deliberate. I set the groceries on the counter, lined them up neatly as if precision could make the air feel lighter. In the living room, he leaned down to pick up something he'd dropped, his phone, a book, I don't remember, and the movement made him wince again, a quiet hiss of breath through his teeth. Without thinking, I asked, "Does it hurt much today?" He nodded slightly, trying to brush it off, but the truth was in his face. That simple exchange lodged itself between us, almost more than the kiss had. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way he let me see that flicker of pain, the way I responded without hesitation. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments. My son returned, laughter echoing down the hallway, and the house slipped back into its usual rhythm. But I couldn't shake the feeling from the car, from the market, from the kitchen table. When I stood at the sink later, rinsing vegetables, I thought about how easy it is for a life to tilt. One day feels like every other, until suddenly it doesn't. And once that shift happens, nothing, not the errands, not the chores, not even the noise of your own child in the next room, can fully put things back the way they were. That evening came with a peculiar kind of stillness, one that pressed down on the house like a low ceiling. The late sun was still spilling through the windows, staining the walls in gold, but the light did nothing to ease the feeling that something unspoken had been steadily gathering all day. My son left just after dinner, tossing off an easy "I'll be late" as he grabbed his jacket and keys. It wasn't unusual, nights out were part of his rhythm, but the moment the door shut behind him, the air in the house felt different. It wasn't quieter, exactly, it was sharper, like the silence between two notes in a song you don't realize you know. I stood at the sink longer than necessary, rinsing plates that were already clean, hearing the faint noises from the living room behind me. The flick of the television remote, the creak of the couch springs as he shifted his weight. Each sound felt amplified, echoing in ways they hadn't before. I told myself to move normally, to act as though this was any other evening, but my body betrayed me, slower steps, longer pauses, a deliberateness to every gesture that only made the quiet more obvious. When I finally walked into the living room, I found him sitting there with a book balanced on his knee. He wasn't reading. He was holding it open, staring at the page like it might give him an answer he wasn't really looking for. The television glowed faintly in the background, muted, an old movie flickering soundlessly. I asked if his shoulder was feeling any better. He nodded but didn't say much, only rotated it slightly, as if to prove it was improving. I sat down at the far end of the couch, the space between us feeling like both a barrier and an invitation. I smoothed my hand over my jeans, a nervous motion, as if the fabric needed flattening. Minutes passed. The movie played without sound. He turned a page in the book he still wasn't reading. I should have left the room, maybe gone upstairs to fold laundry or pretend to sleep, but I didn't. Neither did he. The weight of that choice sat between us, silent but undeniable. At some point, he started to talk, not about what mattered, but about small things, the kind of filler conversation people use when they're trying to keep something else at bay. He mentioned a course he was thinking of taking, a match he might skip this weekend because of his shoulder. I replied in kind, sharing bits of my day, saying how the garden needed weeding, how the new kettle wasn't as good as the old one. It should have felt harmless. It didn't. Every sentence felt like we were building a bridge towards something neither of us could quite name. I don't remember who looked at the other first. Maybe it happened at the same time, a glance colliding in the middle. What I do remember is the pause, how it stretched, how it held. The kind of pause where the room feels smaller, where the air feels warmer, where you become acutely aware of every breath you take. I could have looked away. I should have. But I didn't. We kissed. This one was different. The first kiss had been quick, almost startled, a thing that happened before we knew what we were doing. This one was deliberate. It carried the weight of everything unsaid, every silence, every glance that had lingered too long. And then, as before, we both pulled back, the air between us thick with something that didn't have a name. My hands folded in my lap like I needed to prove they were steady, even though they weren't. He sat back, not moving much, his eyes fixed on some invisible point across the room. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The television flickered, casting pale light on the walls, but I don't think either of us saw what was on the screen. Eventually, I stood, my legs heavier than they should have been. I muttered something about needing to check if the doors were locked, a flimsy excuse, and walked to the kitchen. The coolness of the tiles under my bare feet grounded me for a moment, but when I turned back, I could still feel that kiss like an imprint on my skin. The rest of the night passed in fragments, lights turned off, dishes dried, the faint sound of him moving down the hallway toward the guest room. I climbed into my own bed later, staring at the ceiling once again, knowing the house was carrying something it hadn't before. I told myself I wouldn't think about it in the morning, that I'd fold this night into the long list of things better left unspoken. But even as I whispered that lie to myself in the dark, I knew it wouldn't hold. Some things don't vanish overnight. They wait for you in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table like they've been there all along. The following day felt heavier, as if the air in the house had absorbed all that had happened the night before and refused to let it dissipate. I woke early again, though it wasn't the alarm that stirred me, it was the weight of my own thoughts pressing me out of sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, staring at the grooves in the floorboards, thinking of nothing and everything at once. The memory of that second kiss was still fresh, lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't pull free. It wasn't just the kiss itself, it was what it meant. It was no longer something I could tell myself had been accidental or harmless. When I went downstairs, the house had that strange quiet that feels almost staged. My son had already gone, leaving only the faint trail of his presence, a coffee cup in the sink, his sneakers by the door. The house wasn't empty, it was inhabited, but there was an absence of innocence now. Every sound seemed to land differently, each footstep echoing with an awareness that hadn't been there before. He was already in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, a cup of tea in his hand. He looked up when I entered, and in that instant, I could see it on his face too, the knowledge that something had changed irreversibly. We exchanged brief words about the tea, about his shoulder, about my lack of sleep, but each sentence felt like a placeholder for the conversation we weren't having. I noticed the small changes first, the way he avoided sitting too close, the care he took not to brush past me when moving around the room. It was cautious, but that caution spoke louder than carelessness ever could. He was aware. I was aware. We both understood the edge we were walking on, even if we didn't say it. Mid-morning brought a phone call from my husband. His voice was brisk, polite, distant. He said he'd be delayed another day, maybe two, and for a moment I felt my stomach drop, not from guilt but from the realization that his absence had become something I'd stopped questioning. I hung up and stared at the silent phone in my hand, wondering when exactly I'd stopped missing him in the way I used to. The rest of the day stretched uneasily. He moved around the house, careful but present. Every time I saw him pass by the doorway or heard the creak of a stair, I felt a small tightening in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, it was awareness, sharp and persistent. In the afternoon, I busied myself with chores that didn't need doing. I scrubbed the counter, reorganized a drawer, folded laundry that was already neat. Anything to keep my hands moving, to distract my mind from the thought that kept circling back. We had crossed a line, and we both knew it. At one point, I found myself in the hallway just as he came out of the guest room. We almost collided, both stopping short. That half-second of being too close felt like a confession all on its own. I murmured something about needing to check on dinner, and he nodded, stepping aside, but the air where we'd almost touched felt warmer long after we'd passed each other. My son came home briefly in the late afternoon, breaking the tension like a stone thrown into water. His voice filled the space, talking about his plans for the evening, about friends, about things that had nothing to do with the weight sitting in the room. I clung to that normalcy, even as I felt it slipping through my fingers. Later, after my son left again, the house slipped back into that same dense quiet. This time, it felt different. Not just charged, but fragile, as if the walls themselves were holding back the weight of what neither of us would say. I sat at the kitchen table as evening crept in, the light fading into shadow, and thought about how easy it would be to pretend. To pretend the kisses had been mistakes, to pretend they'd never happened, to fold the memories away like a piece of clothing I never meant to wear. But even as I thought it, I knew the truth: some things don't fold neatly. Some things stay creased, no matter how carefully you try to smooth them out. The proposal to leave the house came almost out of nowhere, though maybe it had been sitting quietly between us for days, waiting to be said aloud. It was late morning, the kitchen window open to let in cool air, and I was rinsing cups when he mentioned that getting away might help clear his head. He said it simply, almost offhandedly, but the words hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. There was a pause, then another, as though the house itself was asking if I'd heard correctly. I wiped my hands on the dish towel, keeping my back to him longer than necessary. I told myself to dismiss the idea, to say we had too much to do, that my husband might call or that my son might need something. But instead, I heard myself saying, maybe that's a good idea. The voice was mine, but it didn't sound like me. The decision happened in fragments. We didn't pack much, just a bag, a sweater, things that could pass as casual, practical. Each item I placed in the bag felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried more than fabric or zippers. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just a drive, just a change of scenery, but the lie was fragile even as I repeated it. The car ride was quiet. Not awkwardly so, but with a thickness that made every sound, the click of the blinker, the shuffle of a bag, feel like it meant something. He kept his eyes on the road, and I stared out the window, the landscape blurring past. Every so often, we'd exchange a sentence or two about traffic, about the weather, but those words were placeholders for everything we didn't dare say. When we reached the small house outside the city, the stillness felt immediate. There were no neighbors nearby, no distant hum of traffic, just the faint rustle of trees and the occasional creak of the old wooden porch beneath our feet. He set the bag down and looked around, his movements careful but certain, as though he understood that this space, this day, wasn't just an ordinary detour. Inside, the air was cool and slightly musty, the kind of scent that clings to unused spaces. I walked through the rooms slowly, my fingertips brushing surfaces as if I needed to remind myself that this was real, that I was here, and that I had chosen to come. For a long time, we didn't talk. We moved around each other quietly, tidying a bit, opening a window, pouring water into glasses we didn't drink from. It wasn't discomfort, it was anticipation, thick and undeniable. At one point, he sat down on the edge of the couch, his hands resting on his knees. I stayed standing for a moment, looking at him, and in that pause, the entire weight of the last days pressed in, the first kiss, the second, the silences, the almost collisions in hallways, the lies I was already telling by omission. I sat down beside him, not too close, not far away. The space between us was no longer a barrier. It was an inevitability. We didn't say anything more. There was nothing left to say. We spent the night together. Those 4 words would echo in my mind later, long after the sun had set and the room had gone still. But in that moment, they weren't words at all, they were a feeling, a choice, a line we stepped over and didn't step back from. When dawn broke, pale and slow, the weight of what we had done settled in around me like the morning light on the floorboards. I lay awake before he stirred, staring at the ceiling, knowing with perfect clarity that the world we'd left behind when we got in the car would not be waiting for us in the same way when we returned. The morning after felt impossibly still, as if the air itself understood the weight of what had happened. I opened my eyes before the light had fully touched the room, the ceiling above me unfamiliar yet already bound to a memory that would not leave. I didn't move for a long time. I simply lay there, listening, to the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, to the steady hum of my own breath, and to the quiet reminder in my chest that nothing could return to what it had been before. He was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even, his face softened in the gray light of dawn. For a moment, I simply watched him, my hand frozen where it had fallen on the edge of the blanket. The sight wasn't grand or cinematic, it was painfully real. And that realness pressed harder against me than anything else. When I finally rose, the floorboards creaked in protest. I winced at the sound, though he didn't stir. I pulled on my sweater, the fabric cool against my skin, and walked quietly through the house. It was small, its corners unfamiliar, and yet already I felt as though the walls knew what they held. In the kitchen, I found 2 mugs in a dusty cabinet, rinsed them out, and set water to boil. My hands moved automatically, but my mind wouldn't settle. Every thought circled back to the same realization: the line we had crossed last night could never be erased. It wasn't just a moment anymore, it was a turning point, one that now lived in everything. I heard the faint scrape of a chair and turned to see him standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly mussed, his expression guarded but not closed. For a second, neither of us said anything. The air between us held both what had happened and what hadn't been said about it. He sat at the table, and I placed one of the mugs in front of him. He nodded his thanks, the simple gesture feeling heavier than it should have. We drank tea in near silence, only the occasional sound of the spoon against ceramic breaking the quiet. The drive back felt longer than the drive there, though the miles were the same. We said little, each word chosen with care, each pause thick enough to feel. Outside the windows, the world looked unchanged: trees, roads, the steady gray sky, but inside the car, it was impossible to ignore how altered everything felt. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of the house greeted us, but it didn't feel the same. The steps, the door, the windows, they were all exactly where they had been, yet they seemed to look at me differently now, as though they knew I was not the same person who had left. Inside, the ordinary rhythms resumed almost instantly. I hung my sweater by the door, checked my phone, glanced at the calendar. But beneath every movement was the awareness of what we'd done. It wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It simply sat there, steady and unshakable, a quiet truth threading through everything. He carried his bag upstairs without a word, his steps measured, his face unreadable. I busied myself in the kitchen, rinsing mugs, straightening towels that didn't need straightening. I could hear him moving in the hallway above, each sound a reminder that we were now bound by something that couldn't be undone. By the time my son returned later in the day, the house was tidy, as if nothing had shifted. He walked in with his usual burst of energy, his voice filling the air, and for a brief moment, I almost believed the illusion of normalcy we'd both constructed so quickly. But underneath, I felt the fracture, a hairline crack that might not be visible to anyone else, but that I felt every time I breathed. That evening, when the house finally quieted again, I sat at the table alone, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. I thought about the night before, not replaying details, not indulging in memories, but sitting with the enormity of the choice we had made. It wasn't something I could tuck away neatly, no matter how much I wanted to. Some truths don't scream, they whisper, over and over, until you can't unhear them. And as the sky darkened outside, I realized that this whisper would follow me now, into every morning, every room, every breath. Coming back into the rhythm of the house felt like stepping into clothes that no longer fit. Everything looked the same, sounded the same, but the seams were stretched and strained in ways no one else might see. My son's shoes by the door, my husband's framed photo on the hallway table, even the hum of the refrigerator, they all belonged to a life that hadn't accounted for what I had done. I moved through it all like someone trying to walk naturally after an injury, conscious of every step, afraid to show the limp. My son was home more that day, dropping his keys on the counter, talking about his friends, his plans, filling the rooms with his easy voice. On the surface, it was ordinary. He didn't notice that my hands shook a little when I passed him a plate or that I couldn't hold his gaze for long. Maybe he chalked it up to fatigue, to the way I sometimes looked when his father was away too long. But inside, I felt like a woman standing on a fault line, waiting for the ground to shift. I caught glimpses of him, my son's friend, throughout the day. At first, they were just flashes, him passing the hallway, him setting a mug in the sink, him bending slightly to adjust the strap of his bag. Each time, my breath hitched before I even realized it, as if my body reacted before my mind could catch up. We avoided being alone together, not in an obvious way, but with careful choreography. He stayed a little longer upstairs, I lingered in the kitchen, both of us aware of the space we were holding. When our eyes did meet, it was quick, almost mechanical. But in those brief moments, there was something there, an acknowledgement, a weight. We didn't need words, the silence between us had become its own language. In the early afternoon, my husband called. His voice came through the line with that familiar blend of exhaustion and efficiency, telling me he'd be home sooner than expected, tomorrow, maybe even tonight if the roads were clear. I murmured my agreement, the usual phrases about being careful, about driving safe. But as soon as I hung up, the air in the kitchen shifted. My fingers tightened around the phone, my pulse stumbling in my throat. The realization hit like cold water, the fragile balance we had been maintaining was about to crack. My husband's return wasn't just the end of his absence, it was the reintroduction of someone who could see the smallest shifts, who would look at me and notice if I flinched, if I hesitated, if I wasn't exactly the woman he'd left. The rest of the day became a performance. I busied myself with laundry, with dinner prep, with sweeping corners that didn't need sweeping. My movements were too deliberate, too careful, but I couldn't stop. If I slowed down, I would have to think, and if I thought too much, I might not hold myself together. My son's friends stayed mostly out of sight. I heard him moving upstairs, his footsteps slow, the faint sound of a door closing. When I did see him, a glimpse on the staircase, a pause in the hallway, our interactions were stripped down to nods, to one or two words, to the barest essentials. Anything more would have been too much. Evening settled in with a kind of false calm. My son left again, promising to be home later, his voice trailing off as the door shut. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the quiet that followed, a quiet that didn't feel empty, it felt fragile, like glass you're afraid to touch. I thought about the drive, about the night away, about the choice that had seemed so simple in the moment but now sat like a shadow over every corner of the house. I thought about my husband's face when he walked through the door, about whether he would see it in me, this shift, this fracture. By the time I turned off the kitchen light, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Upstairs, I heard the faint creak of a floorboard, and I froze mid-step. It wasn't fear of being caught, it was the awareness that nothing, not even the silence, was innocent anymore. The sound of tires on gravel pulled me to the window before I'd even realized I'd moved. My husband's car was in the driveway, earlier than he'd said, sitting there for a moment before the engine cut off. I stood frozen by the curtain, my hand clutching the fabric too tightly, watching as he stayed in the driver's seat longer than he should have, as if collecting himself before crossing the threshold of his own home. The door finally opened, the creak of metal sounding too loud in the stillness. He stepped out slowly, shoulders slouched from the drive, the lines around his mouth sharper in the fading light. I watched him glance at the house, his eyes skimming over the windows, the porch, the walls that held far more than he knew. I backed away from the window and took a breath that didn't steady me. The house felt unbearably small suddenly, as if every corner might betray me. His footsteps crunched on the path, then the scrape of the key in the lock, and I turned to the kitchen counter, pretending to arrange the dish towel, pretending to be absorbed in something so ordinary it might mask the chaos inside me. When the door opened, the cool air came in with him. He set his bag down with the same motion he always used, and yet the sound of it hitting the floor seemed sharper, heavier. He greeted me in the same voice I'd known for decades, steady but slightly tired. I managed to answer, the words barely audible to my own ears, and the moment his eyes met mine, my heart thudded once, hard. He didn't look suspicious. Not exactly. But he really looked, and I felt my breath tighten under the weight of it. He walked into the kitchen, his gaze skimming the room in that casual way that wasn't casual at all. His fingers brushed the counter, touched the kettle, like he was grounding himself in familiar things. I heard movement upstairs, slow, deliberate footsteps, the faint creak of the hallway floor. My son's friend. The sound froze me in place. For a brief second, I wondered if my husband heard it too, if he noticed the timing, if he would put pieces together that hadn't been offered to him. He asked about dinner, his tone easy, but I caught the flicker in his eyes when I hesitated a fraction too long before answering. I turned to the pantry, pulling out something that didn't need pulling out, just to have something to do with my hands. When my son's friend came downstairs, he did it carefully, as if each step had been rehearsed. He greeted my husband politely, his voice controlled, and for a moment I thought, maybe this will pass. Maybe this will all fold itself into something that can be hidden. But the room was thick with something that couldn't be named, and I could feel my husband sensing it, even if he didn't understand it. His eyes shifted between me and the young man, not suspicious, but weighing something. The evening went on in fragments. Bags were unpacked. Stories about the trip were told. My son came home and filled the silence with his usual chatter, but the tension didn't dissolve. It sat quietly under every word, every glance, every pause. When I stood at the sink later, washing a glass that didn't need washing, I saw my husband's reflection in the window. He was standing in the doorway, not speaking, just watching me. His expression wasn't angry, wasn't soft, it was unreadable, and that unreadability made my breath catch. The night stretched on, the house holding all its quiet truths. No one said anything out loud. But I knew, and maybe my husband knew too, that something had shifted in this house forever. There would be questions, eventually. There would be words, eventually. But not tonight. Tonight, there was only this silence, and the knowledge that secrets don't stay buried forever.